Welcome to episode 169 of the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business Podcast. This is Melisa Liberman, and today I'm so excited to share with you a conversation that I had with Ashley Ryall, and she is also an independent consultant. She's been an independent consultant for the last 8 years, and she's going to share with us the experience that she had when she hit the 7-year itch in her consulting business. She shares that that is a real thing and what she did about it. So she took a sabbatical, which sounds crazy. When she told me that the first time, it was just so inspiring and, just opening up this possibility that even though you're an independent consultant, anything is possible for you that full-time employees enjoy. We can enjoy those too. If you've listened to this podcast for very long, I rarely have guests, and Ashley, she's going to bring so much value and just open up your mind to things that you might not have realized were possible. So I'm really excited for you to hear this conversation. And with that, I would love to introduce you to Ashley Ryall. Ashley and I know each other from an organization called Open Assembly. And from that organization, we were chatting and she was talking to me about a sabbatical that she took as an independent consultant. And I just thought, what a concept. So many of us, that thought never really crosses our mind. And so I'm so excited to welcome Ashley Ryall to the episode today. She's going to share with us her experience taking a sabbatical and so many other things as an independent consultant. So Ashley, thank you for joining us. If you would love to introduce yourself, tell the audience about you and your background and all the things.
Awesome, Melissa. Thank you for having me. This is a conversation that is long overdue between us and with your listeners. I'm Ashley Ryall, founder and principal of UntapSocial. We are a thought leadership consulting firm. I help leaders improve their executive presence and get them on stages and give them platforms for them to be seen and heard. I have been an independent consultant for 8 years. The last 15 years, my career has been anchored in kind of at the intersection of professional branding and content marketing. I'm also a speaker and an accountability coach for people who want to live and work with more intention and help designing their work around their life and not the other way around, which is very serendipitous for our conversation today.
It's so perfect. You're an expert in this, and you've partially because you've lived it yourself. Yeah. So good. All right. Well, let's dive in. I'm sure this conversation will take us in a lot of different directions, but let's start off with the sabbatical and then see where we go from there. So tell us a little bit about, you said you've been an independent consultant for 8 years. At what point did you decide you wanted to take a sabbatical?
Yeah, so I'm here to tell you that the 7-year itch is not just for romantic relationships. It's also for relationships with your business. And I'm here to tell you that that is alive and well. So about 7 years in, Melissa, I had burnt out 3 times in a year and a half working for myself. And I was feeling really uninspired and not really as fulfilled with my client work like I had felt in the last 7 years. And I wasn't learning anything new. I didn't feel like I was really being challenged. I felt like I had sort of plateaued. By the way, all great signs that it might be time to look critically at how your work is supporting your life. And so at the same time, I'm a big dreamer. A lot of independent consultants are, if you've decided this work style by choice or by happenstance. And I've always had big dreams for my life. And at the top of my bucket list for the last 10 years has been to walk the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain. So I figured, while feeling a little bit lost in my business, what a great time to go achieve a lifelong dream, right? And so that's kind of how this idea formed, that maybe it's time to take a break and get out of the hustle and bustle of my business. And I realized I needed a break from all of this and to step away for more than just a 2-week vacation.
Yeah. And well, let's come back to the burnout here in a little bit, if you're willing to share with us some of the contributing factors and what you learned from that, because I think that's also a topic that impacts so many of us. But let's keep going with the sabbatical. So amazing, this vision that you created. And so tell us a little bit about how did you think about preparing as an independent consultant who the revenue is all driven by you. How do you start preparing for a sabbatical as an independent?
Yeah, great question. There's so much that goes into this. I would say, after I had made the decision to do this for myself, and I'll come back to that in a second. There were two things that I did next. The next right step at that point was to get clear about two things. Number one, what was the experience that I wanted to give myself on the sabbatical? And number two, what was the experience I wanted to give my clients while I was away? Right? There's more than one way. There's more than one right way to take a sabbatical as an independent consultant. So I think it's really important to get clear on what is the type of experience I want to have on sabbatical. What do I need this experience to be? What is it going to look like? How long is it going to be? When can I take this for my business? Or if you're going on a work trip, if you're traveling, it's good to get clear about when the best time is to go, or when is the right time to go for my business where I can take a pause. And I asked myself those questions, like, what does this experience need to look like for me? Especially, like, we put so much time and effort into taking a sabbatical. There's just so many extra layers that an independent consultant needs to go through in order to do this. You might as well do it right the first time. Right, you're going to be away.
Yeah.
So getting clear on those two things, and then declaring it. And I know it sounds risky, but I started telling my friends and family, I'm taking a sabbatical in September of 2022. And that was in 2021. I gave myself a lot of time, which I highly recommend. And I put a Post-it note on my bathroom mirror just to remind myself why this was important. And then I got to planning and sort of asking myself, what needs to happen so that I can take sabbatical in a way that I am comfortable and confident stepping away from my business for XYZ number of days or weeks or months. For me, thinking about like how to set up my business for success, as a solopreneur at the time, Melisa, I didn't have part-time or full-time staff already working for me. I've set up UntapSocial to be a container for freelancers to work on projects that they're passionate about. So I would handpick freelancers based on their skill sets and expertise for certain client projects, but I didn't have someone that would hold down the fort for me. And I realized for me to take sabbatical, for me to feel comfortable and confident taking sabbatical, I would want someone to hold down the fort of UntapSocial while I was gone. But I didn't have that person in house yet. And so for me, the best decision was to go out and find someone like me who was available and had the level of expertise to be there to support my clients while I was away. But it doesn't have to be that way. You could decide a different path where you put your business on pause, you hire a freelancer, you design your contracts in a way that you can step away from your business for 5 weeks or 2 months or what have you. And we can talk about, I've got some ideas about how to design those contracts, but it takes a lot of planning, obviously. And the more time you give yourself to plan, the better this is going to go.
Yeah. Okay. And why did you choose that path to bring someone on who would take on some of the level of responsibility that you typically are responsible, that you typically own?
Yeah. So my average client contract is anywhere from 9 to 13 months. And so I already had existing client contracts in place that were going to overlap with the time that I wanted to be away for. And I didn't feel comfortable putting those contracts on pause based on the deliverables that we set out to achieve for our clients. And that's why I wanted someone who was, a thought leadership expert who knew the industry that UntapSocial lives and breathes in and could support my clients and be a thought partner and move deliverables along while I was gone. But there are other options too, but that worked best for me in my business.
Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned some other options being bringing in freelancers. So maybe what would that have looked like if you decided to go down that path, Ashley?
Yeah, I think that comes back to project management, right? Depending on the client work that you have available, how can you sort of orchestrate a team of freelancers who possess complementary skill sets based on the client deliverables and the client goals? And how can you get them ready to offload that work onto them in advance so that they are picking up the pieces and they can keep things moving swimmingly? Like I said, UntapSocial was built to be a container for freelancers to work on those projects, but there's wonderful, as you know, open talent platforms available where you can go and vet and hire those freelancers at your disposal.
Yeah. And then the other option would be just to time your contracts, I guess, to take a pause entirely.
Exactly. So I thought about that. I gave myself a good 10 months but from the time that I decided to take a sabbatical into the time that I was actually going away. So again, the more time you give yourself, the more freedom and flexibility you have to design the sabbatical to work for you and so that your clients feel like they're taken care of. So that could mean a couple of things. It could mean that you design new client contracts around the sabbatical so that you're wrapping up projects 3 weeks before you leave, or that you do the bulk of the work, like 85% of the work you deliver before you leave for sabbatical, and then the remaining 20% or what have you, you can wrap up when you get back. I told my clients well in advance, about 8 months in advance, that I was doing this, right? And I think this is key here, Melissa, because clients can react any which way. Oh my gosh, what do you mean you're going to be gone for 2 months? Like, that doesn't work for us, right? And so I think what's important to note here is to set the expectation with your clients about when you're going to be gone, how long you're going to be gone for, all the logistics, when you will or won't be available. Some folks might decide to work a little bit during sabbatical. I chose not to. I wanted to fully immerse myself in the experience, so I chose not to bring my laptop. But I think it just comes back to setting that expectation with your clients so that they know that they are taken care of while you're away, however that's meant to look. And I think what's also important too is to share with them why this is important that you go on sabbatical and how they will benefit from you going on sabbatical, right? For me, it was about burnout and trying to find new creative ways to leverage untapped skill sets of mine that I had been underutilizing, and I needed that time away. And getting clear on that will help me service them better, right? So I think getting their buy-in about like why this is beneficial to them, as well as why it's so important for you, is super important to communicate that message.
What the irony, the untapped skill set that you had that you wanted to kind of unlock while you were on sabbatical, and the name of your company, UntapSocial, all fitting so well together.
It's very serendipitous the way that name has stuck, and all of the different reasons why I chose that name in the first place.
So good. You mentioned you have some ideas about contracts. So is it contracts on the client side or with the consultants and other freelancers you were bringing in, or both? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I was mainly talking about clients, but I'll share with you sort of how that went for me, because I ended up hiring someone to hold down the fort for me during those months. But I think coming back to contracts, I put a disclaimer in my new contracts and an addendum for existing client contracts, again, about how long I'd be gone, what they could expect while I was gone, times I would be available, etc. So I think it just comes back to those expectations. And I think it's worth mentioning too, like, your listeners, they're independent consultants, either by choice, by happenstance, or by life circumstance. But either way, Melissa, your listeners have developed skill sets in creative problem solving, innovation, entrepreneurship, thinking outside the box. And your listeners have done that every day for their clients and for their business. There's ways that you can apply those skills for yourself. And so maybe it's worth after you've decided to take a sabbatical, it's worth looking at your existing client contracts and figuring out maybe how can you adjust them or shift them so that maybe you're delivering a little bit more value up front, or you're meeting your customers where they are. Maybe they're on a different frequency or wavelength or timetable, and there's some adjustments that need to be made that actually work for you to be gone on sabbatical and to help support them in new or different ways that you hadn't thought of before. And so that's where that a little bit of ingenuity comes along to say, okay, how can we make this better? How can we adjust this contract so that it's serving you more and so that I can take this time away that I need?
Yeah, I think it's such an important piece to think about because when we've talked about this on many, many episodes on this podcast about asking yourself a really powerful question. Most of us ask ourselves the question, why wouldn't a sabbatical work for me? And that's not a question we want the answer to. I'm sure your brain could think of 1,000 reasons why a sabbatical won't work for you.
Right.
It's the opposite, right? You asked yourself the question, how could I make a sabbatical work for me and for my clients? And then you went to work on solving that for yourself, for your clients. But it's really about thinking, like you said, applying the tools that you use for your clients, applying them to yourself and your business to ask, how can I make a sabbatical work in my business for both me and for the clients? And so that it benefits both of us. It's not just taking away something from your clients to benefit you. It could be a benefit to both of you. I'm excited for you to tell us more about what those benefits are.
Yeah, beautifully said. Beautifully said.
Okay, amazing. So now let's talk about, so you planned out the sabbatical. It was a long time in the making, 10 months, I think you said, and then tell us what happened next. So what was the sabbatical? What was it like as you started transitioning into the sabbatical you had done so much planning for?
Yeah, sure. So, and to give you your listeners some context, the Camino de Santiago they call it a pilgrimage. It's historical in nature. Hundreds of thousands of hikers hike it every year. There's 13 different routes you can take. I'd seen it in a movie, heard it on a podcast, and thought this would be the perfect journey for me. And I'm a big dreamer. I'm kind of a go big or go home type person. So naturally, I decided that I would do the most difficult route and the longest. And that means the French way. The French way is a 490-mile hike from France over the Pyrenees all the way west of Spain. So you're technically walking over the top of Spain from east to west all the way to the coast. And I think it's important to note here that, again, I had burnt out a lot. I needed a change of scenery. I had put very high expectations on this sabbatical. And I think that's worth noting, right? Because it's hard enough to go on sabbatical. Only 5% of companies allow a paid sabbatical. Only 11% allow for an unpaid sabbatical. It's even harder, if not impossible, for a freelancer or independent consultant to go on sabbatical. And so I had put these huge expectations on this sabbatical to fix all my problems, right? Fix the burnout, maybe sleep under an olive tree, take things at my own pace. My poor Camino, right? Like it stood no chance against all that I had sort of had planned for it and for me in my experience with it. And I didn't get what I came for. Mm. And I think that's maybe a whole other conversation, but I had planned for this experience to sort of shut off my brain and use different parts of my brain and figure out what was next for me in my career. But as we know, our problems follow us wherever we go. And a record number of hikers hiked it that year, Melisa. So typically on average across 13 different routes of the Camino, about 200,000 hikers hike it every year, which is a lot already. But by September of 2022, 365,000 pilgrims had registered and had started on the trail. And so it was an incredibly stressful experience. And it was kind of a race to get a bed. And there's so many options to sleep on the trail, but it was just ridden with anxiety, and I couldn't go at the pace that I wanted to go. And I couldn't get the experience that I came for. And so at some point I had to figure out how to walk my own Camino.
Yeah.
And the implications and results of that are something that I'm still sharing with the world today, because there's so many real world sort of applications to that lesson. But it's really important to note that it's great to be intentional about what you want the sabbatical to be. And I fully believe that the more intentional you are about what your sabbatical will look like, the more positive experience you will have. But it's really important to be open to the outcome and be open to what that looks like.
So thank you for sharing that, because I think the best laid plans, right? You were talking earlier about how important it is to make the intentions, not only to plan for it, but also what you want to accomplish on the sabbatical, but also who knows what might happen, and making the most out of it regardless of what ends up happening. So tell us a little bit, if you're open to it, to Ashley, about how did the sabbatical benefit you, even though it didn't come out maybe the exact way you had envisioned it. Tell us a little bit about what did you take away from it?
Yeah. The sabbatical ended up starting a 1.5 year long journey of sort of me asking myself what's next for my business and my career. And I'm here to tell you, Melissa, I'm not really on the other side yet.
Yeah.
But the Camino experience ignited the start of that. And when I came back, I started to ask myself sort of, again, what additional ways can I be of service to the clients that I have, and what new clients do I want to support? I came back from the Camino and decided to start writing a memoir. So that was a huge benefit that came out of my experience. I feel like I have a story to tell, and learned a few things along the way. I'm only 36, almost 37 years old, but I feel like I've got a lot more to give to the world. And the Camino sort of catapulted whatever those answers might look like. And I've started to figure out some of those answers. And I think the biggest thing is, and this is applicable to all of us as independent consultants, again, is to be open to the outcome, and have high expectations, but for your business, for your life, for your career, for your clients, but be open to getting there differently. So kind of what I mean by that is, it's a perfect analogy. I started off on the Camino. It's a 490-mile trek across Spain. I ended up only completing 275 miles. Not only, that's more than half. I'm fine with that.
Not only, no.
I'm totally fine with that. But halfway through the trip, Melissa, I did the math in terms of how many miles I would have to walk a day in order to walk every single step and get home in time. And I had a revelation that I wouldn't be able to do that based on the time I had left. And so I needed to figure out how I could get a positive sabbatical experience and get what I wanted from this experience, but it would have to look differently. And so I walked a certain number of miles. I got on a train and skipped a section. I spent an extra day at this beautiful albergue that overlooks the river. And I met some wonderful people, had some great conversations that never would have happened if I had tried to push it. And so I think one of the biggest lessons learned there is you can still achieve whatever goal you've set out to achieve, but be open to it looking differently.
It's such a great lesson for a sabbatical, and also just running a business in general. When we are so tightly wound to the way we think it should look, then we oftentimes so often miss all these other, like the view of the river that you spent an extra day at. We miss the big picture and other alternative paths to get there. So
it's so true.
Yeah.
And so many of those skill sets and mindsets we adopt anyway as independent consultants, because we do that for our businesses, we do that for our clients. It's time to apply those skills to ourselves and what we want our life and our work to look like.
Yeah, such great lessons here. Maybe now's a good time, Ashley, to ask you about, if you're open to sharing, what contributed to the burnout, and then how did the sabbatical help you to start to break that down? If it did, tell us a little bit if you're open to it sharing.
Sure. So to kind of fast track, my background's in social media and content marketing. At some point after I started my business, left corporate America, went out on my own. At some point, some larger clients asked, Ashley, you do XYZ, can you do ABC as well? And I said yes and figured it out, right? And so I kind of carved this niche in the future of work, sort of HR talent space, where I was helping leaders and pioneers in those industries get on stage, be heard, elevate their executive presence. And I did that very well. And I was really happy with how I had moved the industry forward by getting those folks a mic and a stage and getting them in front of larger audiences. But at some point, I felt like I had sort of peaked in that specific sector. And I felt like some folks were kind of saying similar things. I was really struggling to find new and fresh perspectives, which is alarming because the future workspace is super exciting, and it still is, as you know. We live and breathe that space, and I love it and will always be, part of my heart. But I wasn't feeling fulfilled in, once I deliver sort of a client project or, whatever great outcomes I was producing, I didn't feel as fulfilled as I used to. And I was upset about that. I was like, wait, what's going on here? Like, I love this stuff, right? And I just wasn't getting that level of fulfillment that I had used to. And again, I wasn't learning anything new. I sort of felt like I was staying in my lane too much in a way that wasn't productive. And a lot of your listeners, like some of us feed off that, right? We love being challenged. We love, we love thinking about things in new ways. And I just felt like I wasn't in the right containers. I wasn't talking to the right people who could give me that. And there were also some other conversations and other things I was helping folks with that I don't typically do, or I wasn't charging for. And I was really sparked by those things. And so, whatever, if it's a passion project or a side hustle or a conversation you're having with a friend, if you're getting more jazzed up about those things than your work, then it's kind of time to like take stock and ask yourself and like look critically about the value that you're bringing to your clients and the value that you're bringing to your work. And I was really feeling lost that what I loved and what I was doing weren't talking to each other, weren't aligned. And that did lead to burnout. I think a lot of times we think of burnout, Melissa, in a way that is linear or in a single fashion, right? That we're just hitting the pavement too hard for too long. And there's just no more energy or capacity left. But I want to remind your listeners that there's another type of burnout. And that burnout is when your work isn't fulfilling anymore, it's not energizing you. And that leads to burnout. And that's the burnout I had. And I didn't really realize it till after I got back from the Camino.
Wow. Yeah. And how did the experience on the Camino start to make that more apparent? And how did it start to unravel some of the burnout or lighten it? Or what was the impact on the burnout there?
That's a great question. I don't know if the Camino necessarily unraveled or healed my burnout because it was stressful and I felt anxious on the trail. That wasn't doing me any favors for my burnout. I think it was going on the Camino and having the experience and what the Camino sort of ignited in me that led to me healing my burnout after I got back. And I'm still healing from it. So I went on the Camino, had this experience. I came back and I said, I need to hire a business coach. Like things aren't working out here, right? She's the one that said, Ash, I want you to try the 20-minute nap for the next 6 weeks. And I think that will help you sort of start to tackle your burnout because burnout is not a quick fix, as we know. And it's taken me 6 to 7 months to get back to a level that I'm comfortable with. By the way, the 20-minute nap can work for a lot of people and it works for me. I've been doing it since October and it's fabulous.
That's amazing.
So again, Melissa, I think it's not necessarily looking at the sabbatical itself to heal whatever it is that
Mm,
you need, although that can happen. For me, the sabbatical was the jumping off point.
yeah. I oftentimes ask my clients, like, what is the job you're giving this thing you're doing? And that's such a good way, maybe a way to frame this of like, what is the job that you're giving the sabbatical? And based on what you've shared with us today, not maybe giving it a job, maybe not a big job, too big of a job, and also being open to it doing a different job. So not being tied to the job you give it. I
Well
love that.
said. Well
Yeah.
said. And yeah, give it some breathing room because
Yeah.
I got so much out of the Camino, but it's none of which what I expected.
Yeah.
I wanted to go nap under olive trees and speak a different language, which I did a little bit. And I met people from all over the world, but there was also some really humbling nights where, I was rushing for a bed. I didn't have a reservation for a bed in advance, and I cried to my friend during like while we're eating, a snack when we got to like the next town. I was like, I don't know if I can continue on like this. Right. So
Yeah.
be open to the sabbatical giving you something that you need, not necessarily what you want. Right. The
I
famous,
love that.
famous
Yeah,
song.
such a good way to say it. Yes. Tell us when you got back then, how did you re-engage with your business? Did you plan to re-engage in the way that it looked previously and then you changed your mind on the sabbatical, or did you leave it open-ended for when you got back? How has that looked?
Yeah, great question. In the planning process, I did give myself a financial buffer to so that when I came back, I would have 2 to 3 months to kind of re-ramp up to speed.
Mm,
And my client contracts were still live until 3 months later. So that's just the way I designed it. But when I got back, things weren't the same. I finished up my client contracts as best I could. I ended up hiring my strategic advisor who filled in for me. She and I ended up working together under the UntapSocial umbrella for the next year because it was such a match, which was another added unexpected benefit from that experience. But when I came back from sabbatical, it took a little while to re-engage, right? Because I was still struggling with what's my business going to look like next year. And that was the ultimate question I kept asking myself and tried to give myself some time when I came back from Spain to do that. And again, what came out of that January 1st, I started getting words down on paper or on my computer for a book. But the sabbatical again, I gave myself time and space to start asking myself those questions. And that's just what I needed. There's listeners who are at different levels of their journey as an independent consultant. And if you have really been loving what you're doing, taking a sabbatical for different reasons is just as helpful. You can come back and reinvigorate what that might look like. But for me, I took all of 2023 to figure out what's next for UntapSocial and what's next for my career and how do things need to look differently. So it's been a long, long slow burn.
but the gift you've given to yourself is so phenomenal in the sense of not giving yourself such pressure to come back and make it look a certain way, or to somehow, so many of us put pressure on ourselves of I should get back to where I was within X amount of time, or I should make the most out of this, or go back to corporate, or whatever all these things are that we tell ourselves. And for you to have given yourself that space as part of your sabbatical plan, even sounds like it's a lot about planning ahead of time, giving yourself space. You mentioned, I think at one point you took 3 weeks off, like a little bit of a break before the sabbatical. You kind of ramp things down. I know when I went on maternity leave, which is not a sabbatical, but I guess in some senses it might have a little bit be analogous in some ways. I was still in corporate at the time, but I worked that day, and then I went to the hospital that night, and I was like, I'm winning. I worked till the very last minute. But in this case, thinking about going on a sabbatical, not just wrapping up work on Friday and then coming back, starting it on Monday. So the buffer you gave yourself in the beginning, and then when you came back, seems like a really important part of this formula that you're sharing with us today too.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, Melissa. I think it's so important because regardless if you have a staycation for sabbatical or if you literally do nothing, I find it hard to believe that you're not going to come back from the experience different in some way, especially the more intentional you are about the experience you want to have beforehand. And so giving yourself space and time to reacclimate back in, and giving yourself sort of the open door for things to look completely different, right? Because a sabbatical is not necessarily just to cure burnout. Like, we do it for all different reasons. Sometimes we need access to the creative parts of our brain that have been just shut off for months, right? And so you might come back and say, oh my God, I have like 9 different ideas for or I want to start a completely new different, like a new business, yeah. Right? And so if we don't give ourselves the energetic space before and after, we might not see those ideas and those opportunities come to fruition. And so I think you really hit the nail on the head. We've got to leave the door open for that.
Yeah. And honestly, Ashley, it takes so much courage for you to have done this, because when you venture into this, knowing that there's some unknown from on the other side can be really scary.
You're singing my language. You're preaching. Yeah, you're singing my language. You're speaking my language. I think, again, a lot of your listeners, right? If we became independent consultants by choice, we have some level of risk tolerance for the unknown. And oftentimes that risk is worth bearing because of the freedom and opportunity it gives us. And so whether you have that muscle or you've had to flex it, whether it comes naturally or not, there's so much applicability to leveraging it to design your work to support your life and not the other way around. That's all. Yeah, that's really all there is to it. And I think a huge part of that, Melisa, is like, if I learn kind of one lesson from this, it's to just let yourself know that it's possible to go on sabbatical as an independent consultant. Give yourself permission to dream a little, right? I don't think we're doing that enough. We're giving ourselves permission to think out of the box and be creative problem solvers and innovate and be an entrepreneur. But maybe if we take like 10% of that and apply it to what we want for our lives and for our careers, I'm sure that we'll all be a lot more fulfilled.
Yeah. It's the lesson and the theme I've heard so many times today with what you've shared is designing your life and the business around the life, not your life around the business, which it sounds like a lot of where your passion is taking you now in that direction, helping yourself do that and other people.
Thank you for saying that. Yes, that is my next TED Talk.
Yes, I love it. You mentioned at one point how the clients could benefit. So how do clients benefit from a consultant that they rely on and trust and lean on for their expertise? How could the clients benefit from a consultant taking a sabbatical?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. I think kind of what I mentioned earlier is the opportunity for the consultant to walk away, to come back, like to tune out in order to tune back in from a client support perspective. So getting out of the day-to-day of my work and having a change of scenery, I'm able to access different parts of my brain that I just haven't been able to access because, the grind is so real and the hustle is so real. And so, it's easy to come back from sabbatical, maybe with some fresh ideas, definitely a level of a newfound energy that just wasn't possible before. I think one of the big things, though, that might be an unpopular opinion here is by stepping away from the business and saying, I really need this for myself, you open the door for a client or a colleague or a friend who hears that you're doing this big thing that, like, what do you mean you're taking a sabbatical as a freelancer? It opens the door and kind of allows them to think about, is that something I need to consider? Right. And so you're kind of teaching and being a proponent of this and saying it's possible, it's going to be hard, but I'm going to figure it out because I need this for my mental health. And And I can't tell, like, no, when I told my clients that I was doing this, there was no ill will. It was all positive feedback. I'm so glad you're doing this. You know, it was all positive feedback. And so, and there were a couple of conversations, like clients who I supported, you know, and our conversations were mostly business. Our relationship completely changed. Like some of my clients would message me and be like, oh, like, what are you planning? And like, which route are you going to go? And my sister did this in 2012. So I was actually able to deepen my relationships with my clients in a way that I otherwise would not have because of this experience. They were far more interested in me going on sabbatical than any of the client work that I was supposed to deliver.
That's so incredible. And that's probably not something most of us would think about as we think about one of the impacts of what a sabbatical would be. But it makes so much sense, right? You as a consultant are leading by example. And one of the examples is some of them are probably furiously looking in their handbook to see what the sabbatical policy was. And if they were one of the 5% or 11% that you mentioned, or the rest of the world that don't get sabbaticals have to quit. That's so amazing.
Melissa. And you remind me of something else that I really want to make sure that I share with your listeners here about looking at a handbook. You know, what are my perks as an employee? Can this happen for me? What's really important for me to share with your listeners is this. Just because we're freelancers and independent consultants does not mean that we should not have the same employee benefits that an employer gives an employee. It does not mean that we don't deserve paid time off and parental leave and a gym in our studio or even a sabbatical, right? And so one of the biggest things that I want to make sure that I get across here is for your listeners to understand that it's important to look at yourself as an employee of your business with the same perks and benefits that employers give employees, right? I don't think we necessarily always think about that, like getting paid time off and parental leave and all of those things. So there's no reason why we shouldn't set up our businesses in the same way.
I am so grateful you've been here today, Ashley, to bring this topic to light, because I think so many of us don't even think this is possible. So to open the door to this conversation, to create an environment in your business that's like you being the employer of choice for yourself, right? That is why you're an independent consultant. You have chosen to employ yourself. And how do you become the employer of choice for yourself? And creating programs like a sabbatical is one of them. That's so amazing.
That's beautifully said.
Oh, so good. Thank you for being here, Ashley. We'll have to do this again. There's so many different topics I know that you've just touched on briefly that I'm sure people would love to hear more about. So thank you for spending the time here with us today. So grateful to know you and for you to be here and willing to share your story.
Thank you, Melissa. I really appreciate you giving me a platform to share more of my story. I can't think of a better person to do it with. So I appreciate your time and having me on.
Thank you. Tell the listeners where they can find you.
Great. Definitely check me out and connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very active there and would love to connect with you.
Amazing. We'll put your link in the show notes. And I know for sure you're going to get messages and connections. I hear all the time people are telling me, oh, I met so-and-so. They found me on your podcast. And so it's always fun to set up those kind of networking connections. So I'm sure your LinkedIn box is going to be flooded with all sorts of questions. So thank you for offering that as an avenue.
Thank you, Melissa. It was great to chat with you today.
All right. Thanks for being here.
See ya.
Thanks for joining me this week on the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. If you liked today's episode, I have 3 quick next steps for you. First, click subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Next, leave me a review in your podcast app so other independent consultants can find and benefit too. And finally, to put the ideas from today's episode into action, head over to melissaliberman.com for the show notes and more resources to help you grow your consulting practice from your first few projects into a full-fledged business. See you next week.